The wind screamed across the empty field, biting at his skin as the veteran gripped his rifle tighter. Echo, his dog, stood frozen eyes fixed on something just beyond his reach. A strange, distant noise, soft but distinct, carried through the air. His breath hitched. What was that? He scanned the horizon, but there was nothing. Just the endless stretch of snow and shadows. Echo growled low, her fur bristling. Then he saw a flicker of movement in the distance. Was it a person or something else? The hairs on his neck stood up. Whatever it was closing in. The veteran's eyes flicked to Echo, now several paces ahead, her posture rigid with alertness. His instincts screamed to follow, but he hesitated. Something wasn't right. The air felt thicker, charged as though the land itself was holding its breath. He swallowed hard, trying to steady his racing heart, but his mind spun with questions. The distant figure hadn't moved yet, but its presence loomed as though waiting for something. Or someone. Echo's growl deepened, more insistent now, and he knew the animal could sense it too. The danger creeping closer, unnoticed by all but her. He moved cautiously, his boots crunching softly against the frost. With each step, the feeling in his chest tightened. The silence was suffocating, broken only by Echo's low growls and the distant whistling wind. As he drew closer, the figure shifted again, barely perceptible in the growing dusk. And then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the figure vanished, swallowed whole by the dark. The veteran's breath caught in his throat. Had he imagined it? Or was something far more sinister stalking them through the shadows? Echo's barking cut through the quiet. Something was coming, and it wasn't alone. The veteran's cabin stood on the outskirts of a forgotten valley, a place where nature had long since claimed its dominion. The land seemed ancient, as if untouched by time or human hand, save for the weathered building that had become his reluctant home. He'd chosen this location for its solitude, an isolation that mirrored the state of his soul. The cabin was modest, built from rough-hewn timber that blended seamlessly with the surrounding wilderness. From a distance, it looked almost like a part of the landscape itself, weather-beaten and humble. In the spring, the valley bloomed with wildflowers and green grass. But now, in late autumn, the once vibrant landscape was muted, as if the earth itself had begun to shut down for the long, cold months ahead. The trees around the cabin were gnarled, their branches twisted like old bones, and they stood like sentinels watching over him in the stillness of the approaching night. Some of the trees were so ancient, their trunks so thick, that they seemed to belong to a time long past, before the world had known war, before the veteran had known loss. The land around him was wild, untamed, and unforgiving. The ground was rough with rocks and scattered boulders, and the roads were nothing more than faint trails carved out by the occasional vehicle or animal. The air here was always thin-sharp with the scent of pine and earth. The winds that swept through the valley carried a biting cold, even in the fall. But it wasn't the weather that unsettled him most. It was the stillness. Here in this vast, silent wilderness, time seemed to stand still. Everything was quiet, too quiet, and it had become a heavy weight on his chest, as though the silence was pressing in on him, urging him to confront the past he had tried to escape. Inside the cabin, the air was thick with the scent of wood and the faint smell of tobacco, a reminder of the life he used to lead the one he had long since abandoned. The stone hearth in the corner was unlit, its cold emptiness matching the rest of the room. A single lamp hung from the ceiling, casting dim, flickering light over the sparse furnishings. There was nothing luxurious about the cabin, just the bare necessities. An old worn leather chair sat by the hearth, its cushions flattened from years of use. A simple wooden table stood against the far wall, cluttered with old papers and mementos, things he had never thrown away but things he had stopped using. A few scattered books, half-read, lay around the room, forgotten and gathering dust. His cot, tucked against the wall by the window, was simple but functional. The sheets were faded, and the pillow bore the deep indentation of years of restless sleep. He rarely rested in this bed for more than a few hours at a time. Most nights he slept in the chair by the fire, a habit that had become ingrained over the years. The firelight, while meager, was enough to keep the creeping cold at bay, enough to stave off the shadows that had a tendency to creep into his mind. At night, when the house was silent except for the crackling of the fire, the shadows took on a life of their own, moving in the corners of his vision, reminding him of things he had hoped to forget. Echo, the veteran's dog, was his only companion in this isolated refuge. She was a medium-sized shepherd mix with a coat as dark as the night itself. Her eyes, bright and watchful, never seemed to miss a thing. She had been with him for years, and over that time they had formed an unspoken bond, a connection born out of shared silence and the necessity of mutual survival. Echo's loyalty was unwavering, and her instincts were sharper than his own. He had come to rely on her in ways he couldn't explain, trusting her not just to guard the cabin but to guide him when the shadows of the past grew too heavy to bear. As he sat in his worn chair, staring into the flickering flames, the familiar silence of the cabin wrapped around him. He had long since become accustomed to this solitude, though at times it felt like a vice slowly tightening around his chest. It wasn't that he disliked being alone, rather it was the emptiness of the place that unsettled him. It was as though the very air here had absorbed his past, the memories of the wars, the battles, the comrades lost, and now every breath he took was tinged with that weight. He had thought that by retreating into this wilderness he could outrun the ghosts of his past, but he had learned the hard way that there was no escaping them. The veteran's fingers absent-mindedly traced the scar on his left arm. It was a jagged line running from his wrist to his elbow, a permanent reminder of the time when the war had touched him physically. But it wasn't the scar that haunted him, it was the memories that came with it. He remembered the heat of the sun on his back, the smell of smoke in the air, and the sound of gunfire ringing in his ears. He remembered his comrades, their faces young and hopeful, their eyes full of life before the war took it all from them. Those memories were the ones that haunted him, the ones that never allowed him to truly rest. But Echo didn't need to know those memories. She had her own instincts, her own past that was marked by loyalty and survival. She had been with him through it all, and as the fire burned low, he found comfort in the sound of her breathing steady and even beside him. She was the only one who remained, the only one who understood the silence that had settled over him. The wind outside picked up howling against the walls of the cabin, a sharp reminder of the world beyond. The trees rustled in the distance, their branches creaking in the wind. Echo's ears pricked up at the sound, and the veteran glanced toward the window. For a moment, he thought he saw movement in the darkness beyond the cabin, but when he looked again, there was nothing. He rubbed his eyes, trying to shake off the sudden unease that gripped him. It had been a long day, and his mind was playing tricks on him. He had learned to trust his instincts, but sometimes those instincts led him down paths that weren't there. Echo growled softly, a low rumble that echoed in the quiet room. The veteran turned toward her, surprised. She was staring at the door, her eyes fixed and intense. He could tell that something had changed in her, something was different about the way she stood, the way her body was tense, ready for something he couldn't see. She wasn't just reacting to the wind or to the rustling of the trees. There was something else, something out there in the dark that had caught her attention. He rose slowly from the chair, moving toward the door. Echo's growl deepened as he opened it, stepping out into the cold night. The wind hit him instantly, a biting gust that stung his face and neck. The snow crunched beneath his boots, the sound sharp and unsettling in the stillness. The moon hung high in the sky, casting pale light across the valley, but the shadows seemed to stretch longer, deeper. The trees loomed like silent watchers, their branches swaying with an eerie rhythm. Echo was already moving ahead, her body low to the ground, her nose working the air. The veteran followed her, his boots crunching louder in the silence than he would have liked. There was a tension in the air, now an unease that he couldn't shake. He scanned the trees, his eyes darting between the shadows, but there was nothing. Nothing but the rustling of the wind and the distant sound of Echo's growls. He reached for his rifle instinctively, his hand closing around the cold metal of the stock. He had spent too many years in the field not to trust his instincts, and right now they were screaming at him that something wasn't right. Something was out there. "Stay close," he muttered, though he knew Echo wouldn't need the warning. She was already ahead, her every step deliberate, purposeful. The veteran could feel the hairs on the back of his neck rising, an ancient instinct taking over. He wasn't alone. Echo's bark cut through the night, sharp and sudden, as if she had sensed something he hadn't. The veteran froze, eyes darting toward the tree line. The shadows between the trees seemed to shift, as if something or someone was moving within them. His breath hitched. Echo's growls deepened a sound of warning, but also something more. Fear. He had seen the dog in countless situations face down threats with her at his side. But tonight there was something different in the way she moved, in the way she watched the trees. Something was wrong, and whatever it was getting closer. The veteran's hand tightened on the rifle. His breath came in sharp bursts, the cold air stinging his lungs. There was no doubt now. They weren't alone. Something was out there watching, waiting, and Echo, as always, was the only one who had seen it first. The wind howled across the valley, stirring the snow into swirling patterns that seemed to come alive under the pale light of the rising moon. It was an eerie, unnatural silence in the air, one that made the veteran's skin crawl. The world outside his cabin had grown still, too still. Echo, the loyal dog that had been his only companion in these lonely hills, sat by the door, her ears flicking as she listened for something just beyond their home. The silence stretched for what felt like hours, until finally Echo's low growl broke it. The veteran shifted in his chair, his eyes narrowing as he scanned the room. Echo rarely growled, unless something had set her on edge. Her instincts were sharp, sharper than his, and she could always sense what he couldn't. He stood slowly, the floorboards creaking under his boots, and walked over to the door. "Stay close, girl," he muttered, as he opened it, stepping into the biting cold. The wind hit him like a slap, and he instinctively pulled his collar up, trying to shield himself from the chill that stung his skin. Echo padded out after him, her steps light on the snow-covered ground, her eyes already scanning the distance. The veteran paused for a moment, taking in the stillness. There was nothing around them but the endless expanse of snow and the looming trees of the valley, their branches heavy with frost. The air tasted metallic, as though the very atmosphere was thick with anticipation. It was as if the land itself was waiting for something to happen. Echo was already on alert, her body stiff, ears forward, eyes fixed on the tree line. The veteran followed her gaze, but there was nothing visible, just shadows in the distance shifting as the wind stirred the branches. The growl came again, louder this time, more insistent. It rumbled from deep within Echo's chest, sending a shiver down the veteran's spine. He stepped forward cautiously, his boots crunching on the snow. Every part of him screamed that something wasn't right. His military training kicked in the way his senses sharpened in moments of danger. Something was out there. Echo took another step toward the tree line, her movements deliberate as though she was tracking something only she could sense. The veteran's hand instinctively moved to the rifle slung across his shoulder. He hesitated for a moment. He had learned to rely on his instincts, and his instincts told him that whatever was lurking in the darkness wasn't a chance encounter. "Easy, girl," the veteran muttered, but Echo wasn't listening. She was already halfway to the trees, her body low to the ground as she moved with the precision of a predator. The veteran followed his heart, pounding his senses on high alert. Then, just as he reached the tree line, he saw it. A flicker, a movement in the distance. It was there, and gone in an instant, a shadow darting between the trees. His breath caught in his throat as his grip tightened on the rifle. He froze, scanning the trees. His mind raced. Had he seen that? Was it just his eyes playing tricks on him? But no, it wasn't his imagination. He had seen it. The shadow wasn't just a trick of the light, it was real. The hair on the back of his neck stood up as the realization hit him. Someone was out there. Echo growled again, this time louder, more forceful. She was close now, her eyes locked on the spot where the shadow had disappeared. The veteran could feel it too, an unsettling presence, something wrong, something far from normal. "Who's there?" the veteran called out into the silence, his voice rough and low. But the wind carried his words away, leaving only the eerie quiet in return. No answer. He swallowed hard, stepping forward. Echo's body was tense beside him, her muscles coiled like a spring, ready to spring into action at a moment's notice. The veteran's senses were on edge. As he pushed deeper into the woods, the crunch of his boots loud in the stillness. Suddenly, Echo froze her body, stiff, her nose twitching as she caught a scent in the air. The veteran stopped as well, instinctively holding his breath. Something was coming. He didn't know how he knew it, but the feeling in his gut was undeniable. Echo's growl escalated into a snarl. She bared her teeth, her eyes fixed on a point just ahead. The veteran's heartbeat quickened. He had seen her like this before. This was more than just a warning. It was a sign that something was here, something dangerous. And then without warning, the ground beneath them shifted. A subtle rustling came from the trees just beyond the shadows. It was faint at first, like the softest of whispers, but then it grew louder. Closer. The veteran moved forward, his eyes darting from tree to tree, but he couldn't see anything, nothing but the movement of the trees swaying in the wind. His breath clouded in front of him, and his grip tightened on the rifle as his mind raced. What was it? Echo suddenly lunged forward, her body a blur, as she sprinted into the darkness, disappearing into the night. The veteran followed without thinking, his boots pounding against the snow as he chased after her. His pulse was racing, his mind whirling with questions. The air was colder here, the shadows deeper. The only light was from the pale moon above, casting an eerie glow over the snow-covered ground. Echo was ahead of him now, her growls growing louder as she drew closer to whatever had caught her attention. The veteran's heart pounded in his chest. His breath came in short, sharp gasps, his every sense alert to the slightest sound or movement. Then through the trees ahead he saw it. A figure. It was cloaked in darkness, its silhouette barely visible against the backdrop of the forest. It was tall, too tall, and it moved with a deliberate slowness, almost as though it were waiting for something. For them, Echo's growls had turned into a full-fledged bark, now warning urgent. The veteran stopped just behind her, watching as the figure shifted slightly, as if it had sensed their presence. A cold shiver ran down his spine, and for a brief moment he thought of retreating. But Echo wasn't backing down, and neither was he. The figure moved again, stepping slowly into the light of the moon, revealing more of its shape. The veteran's heart skipped a beat. It wasn't just a man. It was something else, something twisted. Its frame was gaunt. Its body unnaturally elongated its features, obscured by a hood and cloak. There was a stillness about it, an unsettling calm that sent waves of unease rippling through the veteran. For a moment, neither of them moved. The only sound was the wind, the soft crunch of the snow underfoot, and Echo's snarls growing louder with every passing second. The figure lifted its head, though its face remained hidden in shadow. Its eyes glinted faintly in the moonlight, and the veteran's stomach twisted. He had seen those eyes before, in the darkest places of his mind, in the war. "You can't hide from it forever," the figure whispered, its voice, a low rasp carried on the wind. The words hit the veteran like a punch to the gut, freezing him in place. His mind raced. What did it mean? Who was this? But before he could react, the figure stepped backward, disappearing into the trees with an unnatural grace. It was as if the forest had swallowed it whole, leaving only the lingering chill of its presence behind. Echo barked once more, but the veteran didn't move. His body was frozen, every muscle tense. What just happened? The wind howled again, and the figure was gone. But the veteran knew deep down that it wasn't over. Whatever this thing was, it wasn't just a chance encounter. It had a purpose, and it had come for him. He glanced down at Echo, her body still tense, her eyes still watching the trees. Whatever had been out there in the darkness, it wasn't finished, and neither was he. "Stay close," the veteran whispered more to himself than to the dog. The night had just begun, and with it, the hunt. The veteran couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. Every step he took seemed to echo in the emptiness of the valley, and yet he couldn't shake the sense that there was something or someone still out there, just beyond the reach of his senses. The figure had vanished into the trees, but its presence lingered like a shadow he couldn't escape. Echo, ever watchful, kept her nose to the ground, her ears flicking back and forth, sensing something her master couldn't. The veteran moved with her, his eyes scanning the darkness, his hand never straying far from his rifle. It had been years since he'd felt this level of tension, since his training had kicked in with such clarity. This was bad. He knew that instinctively, but there was more to it than just the danger of a stranger in the woods. The cold knot in his stomach told him that this encounter was only the beginning. They moved slowly, cautiously, the silence surrounding them suffocating. The veteran's breath clouded in the air, but his thoughts were elsewhere, back to the war, to the things he'd done, to the people he'd lost. His mind often wandered to those memories, the ones he buried beneath layers of dirt and distance. But tonight they refused to stay buried. Flashback. The smell of gunpowder lingered in the air, acrid and thick. The veteran stood in the thick of it, his rifle raised, his hands steady despite the chaos unfolding around him. Bullets zipped through the air, the sound of distant explosions shaking the ground beneath him. He had been in these situations before. It was what he was trained for. It was what he was made for. His squad moved in formation, their footsteps steady and synchronized, moving as one unit through the darkened streets of a war-torn city. The mission was simple: secure the perimeter, hold the line, and move on. But the veteran could feel it, the tension in the air, the sense of something about to go horribly wrong. And then it did. A gunshot rang out sharp and sudden, followed by the scream of his comrade falling beside him. The veteran's heart lurched, but he didn't hesitate. His training took over. He moved instinctively, reaching for the man, pulling him out of the line of fire. But it was too late. The wound was too severe. The life drained from his comrade's eyes as the veteran held him in his arms, unable to stop the blood from spilling. "Stay with me," the veteran whispered, but there was no answer. The memory was burned into him, replaying in his mind whenever the darkness crept in, whenever he tried to forget. And it wasn't just the physical wounds that haunted him. It was the choices he'd made, the lives he'd taken. There were too many faces, too many names. You can't hide from it forever. The words echoed in his mind, ripping him from the memory. The figure in the woods had spoken them so casually, as if it had known him, as if it had always known him. The veteran's fingers tightened around the rifle, pulling himself out of the haze of memory. He had to focus. He couldn't let himself drift back into the past, not now. Not when something was clearly watching them. The feeling hadn't gone away. In fact, it had only intensified. Echo growled again, but this time it was different. It was sharp, frantic, her body trembling with a tension he couldn't explain. He looked at her, his own chest tightening as he followed her gaze. The trees, they seemed to move with a purpose, as though they were alive, shifting and whispering with something far darker than the wind. He could feel it now, the pulse of something hidden, something waiting. "Easy," he murmured to Echo, though his voice held no real conviction. The dog had always been the calm between the storm, but tonight the storm felt like it was closing in on them both. Another step. The silence was unbearable now. Each movement in the woods seemed magnified, every branch creaking in the breeze, every snap of a twig sounding like a thunderclap. The veteran's pulse raced his instincts, screaming at him to turn back. But Echo wasn't backing down. She darted forward again, this time at a full run, her body agile and fast, cutting through the snow like a shadow. The veteran followed, heart-pounding, trying to keep up with her quick pace. He was starting to wonder if he was chasing a ghost, if this was all just some trick of his mind. Then the unmistakable sound of a footstep in the snow. The veteran froze. Ahead of them, the figure emerged again, its shape still obscured in shadow, but this time it was closer, far too close. It stepped into the open, its movements slow, deliberate. Echo barked a sharp, angry sound that echoed in the cold air. The figure didn't respond, but there was no mistaking the danger it posed. The veteran's breath caught in his throat. His hand tightened on the rifle, but he didn't raise it, not yet. Something in his gut told him that doing so would be a mistake. The figure spoke again, its voice just as low, just as hollow as before. "You've seen the faces, haven't you?" The words struck him like a physical blow, his stomach lurching at their weight. Faces. The veteran's mind flashed back again, this time to the faces of the men he had killed. The faces of his comrades lost in battle. But this voice was different. It wasn't just the memory of war. It was something else. Something that knew too much. "Who are you?" The veteran's voice was low, controlled. He had to stay in control. He had to stay sharp. The figure didn't answer. Instead, it moved closer, its steps light but sure, like it was walking through the shadows themselves. The veteran stepped back, his body reacting on instinct, his rifle still aimed but not raised. He needed to see more, needed to understand what it was he was facing. Echo barked again this time, more fiercely. But even her growls seemed to falter under the weight of whatever was approaching them. The figure paused, standing just out of reach, its face still hidden. "The past is never far behind, soldier," it said, its voice, now an eerie whisper that rattled the veteran's bones. The veteran's blood ran cold. It was the kind of voice that rattled the foundation of your very soul, a voice that dredged up the darkest parts of your past. His hands shook slightly around the rifle, but he didn't let it fall. Not yet. He had heard enough. Without a word, he raised the rifle, his finger hovering over the trigger. But before he could fire, Echo lunged forward, her body colliding with his legs as she tried to push him out of the way. "Echo," the veteran shouted, trying to regain his balance. But the dog's movement only seemed to trigger something in the figure. A rustling of leaves, a shift in the air, and before the veteran could react, the figure was gone. Vanished into the darkness as if it had never been there at all. The silence that followed was deafening. Echo whimpered, her body trembling beside him, her eyes wide with fear. The veteran lowered his rifle, his heart racing. What had just happened? What had he just seen? The figure had disappeared, but the weight of its words still hung in the air. The past is never far behind, and somehow the veteran knew this wasn't over. It had just begun. The cold had set in deep, seeping into the veteran's bones, but it was nothing compared to the chill that had gripped his heart since the figure had vanished into the woods. The wind howled through the trees, as if mocking his every step, every thought, every attempt to shake the fear that had taken root in him. He had lived through worse, much worse, but this was different. The figure, its cryptic words, the sense of knowing it carried with it. It was something he couldn't explain, couldn't outrun. Echo stayed close, her presence a constant reminder of the bond they shared. But even the dog, usually so confident, seemed uneasy. She moved quietly by his side, her gaze flicking back to the tree line as though she feared that the figure would reappear at any moment. Her usually steady breathing had become shallow, rapid, as if she too felt the pressure of something watching from the dark. The veteran stopped by a small creek that ran through the valley, its surface frozen over in places, the water rushing beneath the ice in a steady, relentless flow. He crouched down beside it, staring into the frozen current, as though it could offer him some clarity. He had made a habit of coming here to this spot whenever the memories of war became too much. The sound of the water, the sight of the ice, it was peaceful, almost tranquil. It was a place where he could escape his own mind for a while, where the weight of his past didn't feel quite as heavy. But tonight it wasn't working. The water seemed to mock him, flowing relentlessly towards some unknown destination, just as his life had been. Relentless. A current of choices, mistakes, and memories he couldn't outrun. "Why now?" he whispered, his voice, low, rough from the strain of the last few days. Why, after all this time, his eyes closed for a moment, the weight of his exhaustion pressing down on him. He had buried his past in this valley, hidden it beneath layers of snow and silence. And now it was surfacing. Slowly, relentlessly. The dog sat beside him, her warm body, a contrast to the icy chill around them. She nudged his arm as if urging him to move to stand, but he didn't feel ready to face whatever was coming. Whatever had already come. Echo's growl, soft but insistent, brought him back to the present. The veteran opened his eyes, straightening as his hand instinctively reached for the rifle slung across his back. Something was out there. He didn't need to see it to know that much. The air had grown thicker again, the tension palpable, as if the very land was holding its breath. The past was closing in. "Stay close," he murmured to Echo. He wasn't sure if it was meant for her or himself. Either way, he moved forward back toward the tree line where they had first encountered the figure. Each step felt heavier than the last, the weight of his doubts and fear slowing him. But he pushed on, driven by something deep within, a need to understand, to confront whatever had emerged from the shadows of his mind. He reached the edge of the trees and stopped. The wind had died down, leaving only an oppressive silence. There was no movement, no sound, nothing. It's just the mind playing tricks, he thought. It's just the silence, the isolation. But something deep inside him, something primal, something he couldn't ignore, told him otherwise. The figure was still out there. It wasn't a trick of the mind. It wasn't the wind or the shadows. The past had come for him, and there was no running from it. Echo whimpered beside him, her body low to the ground. She was alert, her instincts screaming at her. The veteran's fingers tightened around the rifle, and for a moment he considered turning back. But what if it comes for you again? What if you can't outrun it? He shook the thought away. He had to know. He had to face it. The sound of a twig snapping behind him made him freeze. He turned quickly, his rifle raised instinctively. There was nothing, just the trees swaying in the breeze. He let out a breath, a laugh that held no humor. He was losing it. Losing himself to the paranoia, to the fear. But it wasn't just fear. It was something else, something deeper. The weight of his past, the choices he had made, the lives he had taken, they were all crashing down on him at once. The figure's voice still echoing in his mind. The past is never far behind, soldier. He squeezed his eyes shut, forcing the memory back. He had tried to bury it. He had tried to bury everything. But the past had a way of resurfacing. It always did. Echo's growl broke through the silence again, but this time it was louder, angrier. The veteran's heart raced. He turned back toward her eyes, scanning the darkness beyond. And then he saw it. A figure standing just beyond the edge of the trees, watching him. His blood ran cold. The figure was cloaked in shadows, its shape barely visible in the dim light. Its face was obscured, but there was no mistaking the presence. It was the same one from earlier, the same shadow that had appeared in the woods, the same voice that had whispered in his mind. It was waiting for him. The veteran's grip on the rifle tightened, his muscles coiled and ready. It's not real, he told himself. It's a hallucination. It has to be. But as the figure took a step forward, its eyes glinting faintly in the moonlight, he knew. He knew it wasn't a hallucination. This wasn't a figment of his mind. It was real. The figure's voice came again, soft but clear. You can't outrun it forever. The veteran's breath hitched in his chest. He wanted to shout, to demand answers, but the words caught in his throat. What could he possibly ask? How could he demand anything from something that had already taken everything from him? He lifted his rifle, but this time it wasn't instinct that guided his hand. It was the weight of the decision, the choice between facing the figure and running from his past, why he finally managed to rasp. The figure didn't answer immediately. Instead, it tilted its head slightly, as though considering his question. Then it spoke its voice, a whisper lost in the wind. Because you still have unfinished business. The words struck him like a blow. Unfinished business. Was it talking about the war? Was it talking about all the lives he had taken, all the men he had failed to save? Was it telling him that he could never escape what he had done? The figure took another step forward, and with it the air seemed to grow heavier. The weight of his own guilt pressed down on him, and for the first time in years he felt the full force of the memories, the faces, the names, the lives lost. It wasn't just the past that haunted him. It was the consequences of his actions, the things he had done and the things he had failed to do. Echo's growl had turned into a full-fledged bark now, but the veteran didn't move. His body was frozen, not from fear, but from the weight of the decision he knew he had to make. He had been running for so long, but now he couldn't run anymore. The figure took another step, and then without thinking the veteran dropped the rifle, his hands shaking as he fell to his knees in the snow. "Enough," he whispered, his voice cracking. "It's enough." The figure stood motionless, its presence looming, its eyes never leaving him. But the moment it had appeared to demand answers, it seemed to vanish. Without a sound, without a trace, it was gone. The heavy air lifted and the stillness returned. But this time the silence didn't feel oppressive. This time it felt like the beginning of something else, something new. The quiet lingered in the valley, suffocating, as if the land itself had held its breath, waiting for something. The veteran sat in the snow, his knees still pressed against the cold earth, his hands trembling from the weight of everything that had just transpired. Echo sat beside him, her presence, a comforting warmth against the chill, her eyes never leaving the place where the figure had stood moments before. For the first time in years, the veteran didn't feel like he was alone, even though in a way he still was. The figure had vanished, as if it had never been there, but its presence remained more vivid than any ghost or memory he had ever encountered. It had taken form not in flesh, but in his own guilt, his regrets, the things he had carried with him since the war. The figure wasn't an enemy to fight. It was a mirror held up to him, showing him the truth he had refused to see. And for the first time in what felt like forever, he had chosen to look. He had been running from his past, from his choices, from the lives he'd taken, but the past had a way of catching up. The figure had made him face it, and now the weight seemed just a little bit lighter. Echo nudged his arm, gently breaking the spell of silence that had settled over them. The veteran looked at her, and in her gaze, he saw not just a dog, but a companion who had been with him through every dark moment. She had always been the steady hand, the quiet strength, and now, in this moment, she was the reminder that maybe, just maybe, there was still something worth fighting for. "Let's go," he whispered, his voice hoarse. "It's over." Echo gave a small bark as if in agreement, and they both stood. The snow crunched underfoot as they walked back toward the cabin, each step slower now, more deliberate. The cabin seemed further away than it had ever been yet. It was the only place that felt like home. It wasn't the walls or the roof, but the space within it, the space where he could be himself, stripped of the weight of the world and his past. As they walked, the memories of the figure faded slightly, the lingering feeling of dread lifting bit by bit. The valley that had once felt so suffocating now seemed almost serene. The wind still howled, but it didn't seem as threatening. It was just wind like any other. The trees that had once seemed ominous now stood quietly, their bare branches reaching toward the sky like silent witnesses to the passage of time. The veteran glanced down at Echo, his eyes softening. The dog looked up at him with a gaze full of understanding. She had always known that despite the silence, despite the fear, he wasn't really alone. They had been through so much together. And now perhaps they would face what came next together as well. The cabin finally came into view, a warm, flickering light in the distance. It was a small beacon, a safe haven from everything outside, from the haunting memories and the lingering shadows. The door creaked open as they entered, the familiar smell of pine and firewood filling the air. The veteran hung his rifle on the wall and took a seat by the fire, Echo curling up at his feet as she always did. He stared into the flames, watching them dance and flicker, his thoughts, still racing, but this time with a different kind of clarity. The night had been long. The weight of his past had nearly crushed him, but now there was a sense of release. He had confronted it. He had faced what he had been running from for years. And while it wasn't gone, he knew it would never truly be gone. He had taken the first step in understanding it, in accepting it. In that moment, he felt something shift inside him, a release of the tension that had been building for so long. He had made peace not with the past, but with himself. The man he had been, the man he had tried to bury, was still here, still capable of change. The past was a part of him, but it didn't define him. Echo's steady breathing beside him was the only sound in the room. The crackling of the fire filled the silence, and for the first time the veteran didn't feel the urge to fill it with noise, with distractions. There was nothing to escape anymore, nothing to fight against. He looked down at the dog, her eyes soft and trusting, and a small smile tugged at the corners of his mouth. "We're gonna be all right, girl," he whispered, his hand gently brushing through her fur. The fire continued to crackle, and the storm outside slowly began to subside. The night was still cold, but the veteran felt a warmth inside a warmth he hadn't known in a long time. It was the beginning of something new. The next morning, when the light of day finally broke through the window, the world looked different. The snow was still there, blanketing the valley in a quiet calm, but there was a new sense of clarity. The veteran knew that he still had work to do, that the journey of redemption was never truly over, but for the first time in years it didn't feel like something impossible. He stood up, stretching, as he glanced at the rifle resting against the wall. It wasn't just a weapon anymore. It had been a symbol of everything he had tried to escape, but now it was simply a tool, nothing more, nothing less. Echo padded over to his side, nudging his hand. Her loyalty, as always, was unwavering, and in her the veteran saw everything he needed to move forward. He wasn't alone. He wasn't running anymore. And for the first time in a long time he felt hope, a quiet, steady hope, that perhaps after all the years of pain there could still be redemption. The fire burned steadily in the hearth. The world outside was vast, and its dangers still lurked in the shadows, but for now the veteran felt peace. The journey had been long, and it wasn't over yet, but at least for now he had found a way forward. And Echo would be with him as always. Together they could face whatever came next. The morning after the storm had passed, the valley was bathed in a quiet light, the sun barely breaking over the mountains, casting long shadows across the snow. The veteran stood by the window of the cabin, his breath fogging up the glass as he gazed out into the wilderness. The world was still serene, as though untouched by the chaos of the past few days. But he knew better than anyone that serenity was fragile. The storm had come and gone, but the landscape was still scarred by its passage, the deep marks left behind by the howling winds and the bitter cold. Echo lay on her bed by the hearth, curled up in a ball, her chest rising and falling steadily. She was the picture of calm, of peace. But even in her sleep, there was something alert about her, an ever-watchful guardian, ever ready. The dog had been his anchor, his constant companion in the isolation of this valley, and her loyalty had never wavered, not even when the shadows of his past came calling. The veteran sighed softly, his gaze shifting to the rifle still resting by the door. It was no longer the tool of escape or violence it had once been. It was just an object now, an extension of the life he had built here, one that no longer controlled him. He knew that it was a part of him, a part of what had made him who he was, but it no longer defined him. He had been given a chance to make peace with it, to choose how he would face the world and the past that had always followed him. The past is never far behind, the figure had said. The words still echoed in his mind, but now they didn't feel like a threat. They felt like a reminder. The past was something to be understood, not feared. It was a part of him, as much a part of him as the scar on his arm, or the memories that came unbidden in the quiet of night. But the past didn't have to define the man he was now. He could choose. The weight of that realization settled over him, comforting in its simplicity. He had always believed that the only way forward was to outrun the past, to bury it beneath layers of time and distance. But the truth was different. He could move forward, but not by running. The path to redemption wasn't about forgetting, it was about accepting, understanding, and choosing to live differently. The past would always be there, a part of him, but it wouldn't control him anymore. He turned back toward the hearth, the flames still crackling in the stone fireplace, casting a warm, flickering light across the room. Echo stirred, lifting her head to look at him, her eyes soft and full of trust. She had been with him through it all, the steady presence that never wavered. And now she was the bridge between the past and the future. In her gaze, he saw not just loyalty, but the quiet understanding that life would continue, that it had to continue. The storm might have passed, but there was still more to come. He stepped away from the window and moved toward the table, picking up the old journal that had been sitting there for weeks. He hadn't opened it in ages, hadn't felt the need to. But today, something urged him to. Slowly, he flipped through the pages, his eyes scanning the familiar, faded words. Memories, thoughts, moments that had once felt like the weight of the world. As he read, he found something unexpected. The simple act of revisiting these pages didn't dredge up the pain he had feared. Instead, it brought clarity. It brought perspective. The veteran closed the journal and set it down on the table. It wasn't a crutch anymore. It wasn't something to run from. It was just a part of his story, one chapter among many, some dark, some light. The story wasn't over, not by a long shot. "Let's take a walk, girl," he murmured to Echo. She perked up at the sound of his voice, her tail wagging in acknowledgement. She had always been in tune with him, always knowing when the time was right to move forward to face whatever the world had in store. The two of them walked out of the cabin, stepping into the fresh, untouched snow that covered the valley floor. The cold air bit at his face, but it wasn't the sharp sting it once was. The world was still. The only sound was the crunch of their footsteps in the snow, and the occasional rustle of the trees as the wind began to stir again. The world was waking up after the storm, and so was he. They walked for a while, just the two of them, through the woods and back toward the creek where he had found some peace the day before. The water was frozen now, but there was something beautiful about the stillness, about the way the landscape had settled into this quiet, fragile calm. As they reached the creek, the veteran paused, his hand resting on the edge of the ice. He could feel the pulse of the earth beneath it, the slow, steady flow of the water moving beneath the frozen surface. The world wasn't static. It was always in motion, always shifting, even when it seemed still. And so was he. He wasn't the same man who had walked into these woods weeks ago, consumed by guilt and fear. He had faced his past, made peace with it, and now he was free to move forward. He glanced down at Echo, who stood by his side, her body relaxed and content. Together they had faced the storm, both external and internal, and together they would face whatever came next. The veteran took a deep breath and looked out over the valley once more. The future was uncertain, but it wasn't something to fear anymore. He had his life, his purpose, and his dog, and that was enough. He could live with that. The sun hung low in the sky, casting a golden glow over the valley, and the veteran knew deep down that this was only the beginning. They turned and made their way back toward the cabin side by side, ready for whatever tomorrow might bring.